you. Well, theoretically, I'm mic'd, and I think that's on, so we're good to go. You know, I've been asked to introduce a little bit about us and kind of remind you of some things that about us, and so of course my wife said let's make sure we have a list. And that's what. That's how we all balance each other out. So let me tell you a little bit about what our ministry is right now. Right now Judy and I attend Hobart Community Church over there, and most of you know the Atkins, but they're with Faith Bible. We also have a part in the ministry at Faith Bible. I serve in my role as the Northwest the Western Washington Field Director. It also includes the role of being a part of the leadership of Faith Bible. And so I'm part of the elder role. I have an elder role there. We recently had to kind of go through a difficult situation. You might be in prayer for the church about a situation of church discipline. And so we just went through that just 2 weeks ago. We had to finally talk to the church about someone who refused to repent of their own situation, and you don't need to know the details, but you do need to know that it hurts the church to talk about sin and address sin. And let me just say this too: is I give you these free little things every once in a while while I'm talking, but you don't sin in a vacuum. When you sin, everybody's impacted by that. Your family, the people you know, the people you love, and please be aware that that's just a difficult thing. So I serve in that role, but also at Hobart. Judy and I attend there as often as we can, which is usually, I'd say, for 3 or 4 Sundays a month. And I lead the adult Sunday school every Sunday morning. In fact, this morning, tonight, we're going to go through 1 Samuel a little bit. We're going to look at one chapter at 1 Samuel. We're going to talk about that, kind of walk you through kind of what we're doing there. Because I love the book so much, I'm having a great time in that book. But I also lead the worship service, and that's... I'm the song leader, and when the opportunity exists, I also preach for Pastor Rob. People call me the associate pastor, and Judy's the associate pastor's wife, but we don't get paid for that, but that's okay. There are lots of things we do that we don't get paid for. And Judy also leads the children's church. She has a group of kids that she's been faithful with. In fact, we were just talking about it the other day. There have been young women that have gone through her leadership and are now married and have their own families. And in fact, they are a strong influence on the young ladies that are in the group now. It's kind of fascinating to look at that kind of progression. With NICE, we usually visit pastors. One of the roles that Judy and I have is to meet with pastors and their wives and to pray with them and to kind of help them talk about something that may be on their heart that they just not sure what's going on. This is generally speaking with NICE missionaries, but it also we also speak with others that are in pastoral roles and that we can kind of come alongside of and pray with, talk to about the Lord, not about the Lord, but about the things that they're struggling with, wrestling with, and just kind of an outlet for them. From on another level there, I know that some of you have been concerned about our health. Thank you so much for praying in the last year. It's been an interesting year. I said to Judy the other day that, I don't feel sick, but evidently my health record shows a little bit different. I had quadruple bypass in August. Quadruple bypass is one of those things that, for me, I just felt a little tired, went in to see the doctor on Wednesday. They said, come see us on Friday, you need a stent. On Friday, they said, come see us on Tuesday, you need quadruple bypass. So that was how my week went. I remember leaving my office on Thursday and told my boss, because I also work full-time, told my boss, well, listen, I'm going to go get a stent, but evidently it's a weekend procedure, and I'll see you on Monday. 6 weeks later, I was back at work. So that was kind of a challenge, a little bit of a surprise. And then just about 3 weeks ago or so, I was struggling with some pain in my shoulder, and I thought that, that I'd pinched a nerve or something. It was really painful, extremely painful. And Judy was convinced I may have been having a heart attack. And so since I wasn't sleeping anyway, I just got up at 3 o'clock in the morning and went into the ER. And they said, no heart attack, shingles. So I went through the shingles. And if you've ever had shingles, imagine a million little midgets poking your arm with needles, just having a good old time. Just poking and pushing and poking and pushing and poking and pushing. So praise the Lord, that's behind me. And like I said to a friend of mine at Hobart, I said, I don't want to infect anybody at church, but if I did, I'd make a list, but you wouldn't be on it. So, but praise the Lord, that's all going better now, and that's behind us. Now, just kind of the infection part of it, if you shake my hand, don't worry, I'm not infectious, so you're safe. But there's still the pain thing that I have to kind of get past that. That takes a little bit longer to. They gave me this bucket full of pain things, and I'm grateful they did. And then on a family level, I would ask you to pray, and pardon my cry for prayer on this, but our daughter and son-in-law have been seeking to adopt a child for 2 years now, maybe 2.5, and the Lord just hasn't opened that door yet. And if you would pray with them, they just have a real burden. They believe God has a child out there that they want to bring into their home. And they have had this burden for years. And interestingly enough, her last child, they told her that she was fortunate to have lived through the birth because the wall of her uterus was so thin. And now they're looking to see God provide for theirs, so pray for them. For Roy and Elvia, many of you know the Spragues. They, like the rest of us, aren't getting older or aren't getting younger. They don't seem that much older, but when you watch them a little bit, you notice that they're slowing down. So pray for them. They are still very active in ministry. Roy has a tremendous ministry with leadership as he helps them guide through other problems. So if you think of Roy and Elvia, do pray for them as well and keep them in your prayers. So that's a little bit about us, and I don't know if you have, if you have any questions, we can talk about those. But I think that kind of sums up a lot of what we do, and we find ourselves fairly busy. Judy still writes, by the way, for a devotional magazine, not a magazine, but a publication. So about every third month or so, she's getting that together, a monthly devotional that's delivered out to across, really, I don't know, about 6 continents anyway, 6 different places, and people are, and she's a part of a group of people who do these devotions, and it's really focused on women, or for women, and it's kind of a unique ministry. She never thought it would go that far. She kind of didn't really know if she wanted to do it in the first place, but she started writing, and it's expanding, and it's not, she doesn't do it for the money. I think she does it for the fellowship and the companionship that's in that, but it's been quite profound. I think the next one she's working on right now, you might be interested in this, is when God asks a question. What are those times in the Bible when God asks a question? Like Moses, for example, God said to Moses, "What's that in your hand, Moses?" What does it mean when God asks a question? He asks Adam, he says, "Adam, where are you?" You think God didn't know where Adam was? Or did God want Adam to figure that out? Think about that. It's kind of an interesting thing. So I enjoy listening to them. We interact with those, and we go back and forth on those. Well, what I wanted to do tonight is to continue kind of Bible study. I am just such an advocate of the truth and the value of the Scripture, and I believe God has given us the entire Bible for us to learn from, to gather from, and just because it's in the Old Testament doesn't mean for the New Testament believer that there isn't things in there that are very valuable and very important for us to look at. So if you want to open your Bibles, we're going to look at 1 Samuel chapter 4. Now you might ask, why did he choose 1 Samuel chapter 4? Well, 1 Samuel, we're going through this in our Sunday school, and we have really enjoyed looking at 1 Samuel. It's a tremendous book. But the first 3 chapters of 1 Samuel, I think, are a little bit different than as we start to get into chapter 4, where there are lessons to the nation that I think translate into the New Testament that I think are be very helpful for us. And what I want to do is I kind of want to walk through this passage together, and I may ask you questions, and you may feel free like you want to answer those. And please feel free to do that, because that's kind of what we're going to do. We're going to talk about this. We're going to walk through it. But I kind of want to put you in the mood for 1 Samuel. What is the book just before 1 Samuel? Does anyone remember that offhand? Ruth. Oh, okay, you're right. Before Ruth. Judges. That's right, Judges. What do you remember about the book of Judges? Anything? Cycles. That's right, the cycles. And the cycles in Judges, they're about what? They're about a people who pretty much had, they would sin. This was the cycle I remember in college. Maybe you remember it a different acronym. But they would sin, and then when they would sin, what would happen to them? They'd get sent into slavery. Sin, because remember, God is creating, He's not just making an easy nation. He's not just making life easy for the nation of Israel. He's trying to make a nation that impacts the world. So when they would sin, they would go into slavery. And then what would happen when they're in slavery? They would cry out to the Lord. And you know the S word that comes out for prayer is what? Supplication. So we have sin, slavery, supplication, and what happened when they'd cry out for help? Salvation. And then after they had salvation and God had brought them out of a problem, they had silence. So you see that it's kind of a different pattern. And as you go through the book of Judges, you see that pattern happen several times. And when we come into 2 Samuel, life is going to be a little bit different. In 1 Samuel chapter 1 is all about, and you know, there's tremendous lessons in here, but it's all about, it's really a prayer for Hannah and about all that's happening in her life and how Samuel is born to Hannah. And then chapter 2 is talking about Hannah's rejoicing about all that God has given her. And I don't mean to skip over that because I don't think there are lessons in there, because I believe there are absolute lessons in there. But I want to get into something I think that is probably a little crisper and easier to kind of relate to. And then there's the call of Samuel that we have in chapter 3. And when we get to chapter 4, now we have pretty much the same thing that's been happening in Judges, because the nation as a whole they're in a state of rebellion. They're in a state of sin. And what happens in that, as God often does, God brings someone into their world to kind of get their attention. So in verse 4 it says, chapter 4, 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 1, the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Now Israel went out to meet the Philistines in battle and camped beside Ebenezer, and the Philistines camped at Aphek. Now I'm going to mispronounce words here, and so when I do that, you're going to say, that's just Bob, he's an old guy, forget it, don't worry about it. So when you read them and you know these are right, you just say you're okay with that. So you can kind of see that in this environment, we have an opposition, we have a problem to come upon us. And what we're going to see is a problem-solution situation. We're going to see something happens to Israel, and they're going to look for a solution. But we need to watch and see what they do for a solution. So here's the problem. It happens in these first few verses. The Philistines drew up in battle array to meet Israel. When the battle spread, Israel was defeated before the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the battlefield. So there's a battle. Philistines are going against. We know the Philistines are the bad guys, right? They're the bad guys. They're the guys with the black capes and black horses. So they're the ones we don't like. And the Philistines come against them, and what happens? How many are killed? 4,000. 4,000. This is an important number to keep in your mind, right, as we look at this. So when the people came into the camp, the elders of Israel said, "Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines?" Yeah, that's a good question. Whenever you meet some kind of a problem, they didn't look at the Philistines as having defeated them. They looked at the Lord defeated them. So there's something about that that's not all messed up, not too messed up. But watch what they do. In verse 3, "Let us take to ourselves from Shiloh the ark of the covenant of the Lord, that it may come among us and deliver us from the power of our enemies." When I was a young believer, when I was a young Christian, I was just starting to read my Bible, and I was under the impression they were carrying the Ark of Noah around in the desert. So it wasn't until I got to reading this thing a little bit more that I realized they're not carrying a big boat. They're carrying this thing that contains the ark, and it's I don't know about Indiana Jones and all that stuff, so toss that out of your picture. But it contains the precious things of God. But to the nation of Israel, it signified the presence of God. And when they do this, what's going on here? What are the elders thinking about this? What's their thoughts? Notice, what are their choices when they know that the Lord's defeated them against the Philistines? What could they have said?
Why?
They could have said, "Why? What have we done?" But what do? They go to get a piece of furniture. A piece of furniture. Okay, that kind of becomes kind of important as well. So they want, and look what they say here. They say, "Let us take to ourselves from Shiloh the ark of the covenant of the Lord, that it may come among us and deliver us from the power of the enemy." What's their trust in? What do you think? Anybody? The furniture. Yeah. They think, you know what, we'll grab this little piece of furniture, this cool little thing that represents God, and we're going to drag this into the battle, and we'll be okay. This sounds to me like a good luck charm. Could you imagine treating the precious things of God as a good luck charm? Could you imagine getting into trouble and thinking, boy, if we just had a cross around our neck, life will be okay? Now, I'm not saying that a cross is bad. Don't get that. Don't get that, please. But keep in mind that a cross is not a good luck charm. It's not your lucky item into battle. So, watch what happens, though. Like everything that we put in bad position, God kind of tends to want to teach us a lesson. So they come back and they decide that they're going to do that. So in verse 4, "So the people sent to Shiloh, and from there they carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts. It sits above the cherubim, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, and they were with the ark, and with the ark of the covenant of God." Now, we didn't read this about these two, but these two are rascals. These two are bad guys. We'll see that a little bit later, and we'll probably see that as I'm pretty sure that this is where these two are just bad people. And somehow or another, Eli let it happen. Eli was a spiritual leader. He led the nation, but it doesn't mean he didn't make bad decisions, and he let this happen. And not only that, by the way, there's already been some prophecy, and you may or may not remember this, but these two were declared that someday these two are going to die on the same day. So Eli knew this was coming, but he lets a bad decision be made. And this ark heads into battle in verse 5. The ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, and all Israel shouted with a great shout, so that the earth resounded. Can you get a picture of what's going on? You get a picture of what's going on there? The lucky thing, the lucky charm has come into camp, and everybody's excited. And what is this? You know, we know eventually that this is going to be proven wrong, but do you know some people entertain the thought that if there's a lot of noise, that something good for the Lord must be happening? You know, noise is not an indication that God is doing something remarkable. You know, there are some people that won't go to a church that doesn't have, you know, people standing up dancing and screaming and yelling. Because they just think, oh, this church, nothing happened in this church. Nobody's making any noise. To some people, they equate a lot of noise and activity that God's blessing. But let's watch. We'll watch and see what happens. So they go on. And even the Philistines, by the way, they were, of course, we can't really be too upset about the Philistines, because did they know the Lord? Yes or no? Philistines know the Lord? Yes or no? No. So when the Philistines hear all this noise, how do they respond? Verse 6. When the Philistines heard the noise and the shout, they said, "What does that noise of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews mean?" They were confused about it too. So, you know, they were viewing that great noise and God's working were the same thing. God's great noise. God doesn't necessarily move through great noise. There's a number of preachers that probably could show you just how wrong that is. Hopefully I'm not one of them. But they understood that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, and the Philistines were afraid. They were afraid because they knew more about who God was, probably at this moment, than the nation of Israel seemed to realize. They feared God more than perhaps the people in Israel. And they said, "God has come into the camp. Woe to us, for nothing like this has ever happened before." And verse 8, watch this too. "Woe to us, who will deliver us from the hand of the mighty gods? These are the gods who smote the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness." This was over 400 years before that Israel had come out of the nation of Egypt. And this was still something in that area that everyone knew was true. You see, the power of God, when it's demonstrated, it impacts the world. And it doesn't die out quickly. So the ark, they're concerned, and the elders really sense that they really need something, but they were wrong in the way they sought help. They saw the ark of God, as a lucky charm. That's the best thing I can think of. I know it sounds like it's breakfast cereal, but they were looking at it like a good luck charm. They were kind of bringing into the area, and they turned to methods that God never approved, and they were willing to do anything if it would work. You'll see this throughout the book of 1 Samuel if you go on and read anything. You'll see people who take a step and try to do anything to get God's blessing. And even though they're trying incorrectly to get there. And they also think, that their position, by the way, the elders, they said that maybe, if you look back in verse 3, that it might come among us and might deliver us. They weren't even sure that it was going to work. But they're willing to try anything at all. So, as they bring this out, Israel has this confidence. They shout so loudly that the earth shakes. And just because, like I said, just because there's shaking doesn't mean that something remarkable is happening. And again, the Philistines recognize all that. So we get to verse 10 and we find out the end results. And watch what happens when you use something God intended one way for the wrong way. In verse 10, "So the Philistines fought and Israel was defeated, and every man fled to his tent. And the slaughter was very great, for there fell of Israel, how many? 30,000. They fought the first time, there were 4,000. They misuse what God had given them like a good luck charm. They bring it into the battle thinking it's going to bring them good luck, and now it goes from 4,000 to 30,000. This is a picture of a nation that's self-destructing because they're using the things of God incorrectly. And to me, I find that kind of shocking, actually. So as we kind of look at that, we see that, and I'm kind of going through this maybe too quick, I don't know, but so this ark goes into the battle, and God doesn't bless their superstitious power about the power of the ark. God doesn't do that. He doesn't allow them to misuse his things for their own personal gain. And I think that's really important. We make that same mistake. We believe that God is with us. We don't need to try so hard sometimes. Maybe they went into that battle and they thought, you know what, we got God on our side. We don't need, we got our lucky charm here. We got our lucky peace here. We think God's on our side. We think the work's going to be easy. I'm telling you that sometimes churches approach the same, have the same mentality. They think because God's on their side, no one's going to fight them, no one's going to go. They don't think they have to do any battle or anything serious. When the truth is that Israel may have well headed into this with all the confidence in the world, but the ignorance because they were bringing the ark into a battle in a way that God never intended them to do. And, as churches in this day and age, sometimes we bring things into the battle that we don't need to, even from work and from home and in our own personal homes. There are things that we think that it's going to be easy because God's on our side. Just because God is on your side doesn't mean the battle's easy. And sometimes we do whatever we want because we think that we'll have victory. The nation actually, and you'll see this later in the chapters, the nation actually needed to repent before God. What they really needed when they noticed that they were defeated in battle, what they'll do later under other leadership, in fact, you see this quite a bit in the book of Joshua, is that whenever trouble was met, they tried to find the sin in the camp. They examined their walk with God rather than trying to figure out how do we bring something, how do we find something lucky to bring into this battle. So it's kind of fascinating, I think, in a way, as you look at this, is that when they go into this battle, God didn't feel obligated. God doesn't feel obligated to bless them just because they have the ark. So he's God, and by the way, God doesn't like you or I to twist his arm. Have you ever been around when these people start to tell God what to do? Have you ever seen that on the TV or anything? Sometimes you're flipping through the channels or you're doing something else, or maybe you're listening on the radio. And you got people telling God what they expect him to do. That kind of a pretentious attitude toward God is extremely dangerous. I don't know how most of the time, by the way, these are related to people who believe you can get rich by telling God what you want. We are not in charge of God. I once heard it said that there's no extra seats on the Trinity. Nobody gets to take a new place on the Trinity because all the positions are already taken. And when we start to recognize who's God and who isn't, that's an important thing. But God is not going to have his arm twisted by the superstitions of the Israel. And he's not going to have his arm twisted by our superstitions when we approach things and we try to treat them. So Israel falls, 30,000 soldiers fall, and not only did they lose, they lost a lot worse than they ever did before. So as we see this chapter, we're seeing all of a sudden now that when we go to battle, when we're in a spiritual battle, when you and I are in a fight for our children's hearts and souls, when you and I are crying to God for our grandchildren and the battles that are going on for our grandchildren's hearts in this life, or our friends' hearts in this life, we need to recognize that God is not going to be, He's not going to be arm twisted or controlled. We can plead before Him, and His sovereignty works. His sovereignty will take care of the things. But again, we are dependent upon Him to move. We cannot make God do anything. We can plead with Him. We can cry for those we love. But when we start to think, well, you know what? My grandson, if I just give him a Bible, that'll... Well, sometimes that's... I understand this. The Bible is not... It's important, but it's not a lucky charm. It's not a lucky item. It's not a thing to control God. Anyway, so this loss, it kind of prompts them to reconvene. You see this here, the Philistines fought in verse 10. The Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and every man fled to his tent. And the slaughter was great, for there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. And look in verse 11. Not only did that item that they brought in superstitiously, that lucky charm, what happens to that? In verse 11, the ark of God was taken, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. When we have an item that we begin to idolize, and by the way, it sounds odd, but any good thing can become an idol. Any good thing. And when we start to idolize something, God often takes it away. That's what He did with Israel. Now He's going to give it back in due time, but right now, because they had a superstitious view of what the ark of God could do, they were not relating to God as the sovereign. They were looking for some kind of a solution to their problem. And because they came into this thing thinking that this thing, this idol, this will help us win, God, because He's forming a nation to declare His holiness to the world. He takes the idol away. Now, you might say, wait a minute, this is the ark of God. How could this be an idol? Because they didn't see God. They saw the thing as being the source of power. Does that make sense? Is there anything in our lives sometimes we do that? Is there anything sometimes we fall back on, thinking that, I'm in a bit of a spot. How am I going to get out of this spot? I'll tell you one way that happens. In fact, we were talking to somebody not too long ago who had a problem with gambling. And we were talking to them about that and trying to convince them to explain to the fact that because every time there was a problem, they looked for something other than God to solve their problem. I said, do you realize what's going on here? Is that your gambling is an effort to replace a call to God for help. Now, it could be any number of things. I mean, Judy and I, one time, we had a stove go out on us. And so when the stove went out, we said, well, our first thought is, well, where are we going to find the money? So we look into money. And so we started to ask the Lord about what to do and pray about that. And honestly, truthfully, We have no idea why, but someone sent us a check for $1,000. Never sent an explanation, just said, here's a check for $1,000. Well, that just happened to be about the price of the stove. Minus a little tax and license, and who knows what else. But you know, we could have at that point started to begin to solve our problem without seeking God's help. When we try to solve a problem, we run away to, and the phrase I think a lot of is Egypt. When we run away somewhere else for help, before we seek God's help, we're looking for something. We're looking for a human way. We're keeping God out of the equation. We're not asking God, what should we do? We're asking ourselves, how can we solve this? That's what Israel was doing. What makes sense to us? What sounds like a good plan? And that's where they tried to go. So God doesn't feel obligated to solve that. And as he kind of goes through that, we see that the ark of God is captured. And in fact, if you were familiar with a little bit earlier in 1 Samuel, Eli and Eli's children, Hophni and Phinehas, were both predicted to die. Eli had heard that word early in his life. Samuel had repeated it when God had talked to him about it earlier in the chapters, earlier in this book. And in fact, this is the day that they were going to die. And not only that, when that was prophesied to him, God didn't tell Eli everything that was going to happen on that day, because there's a whole lot more. God didn't tell Eli, by the way, the ark of God's going to be captured that day. And by the way, I got plans for you that day too. So it's kind of interesting on that. And so we see here in verse 12, in this same chapter, now a man of Benjamin ran from the battle line and came to Shiloh the same day with his clothes torn and dust on his head. A lot of people think this was Saul, by the way. Saul was particularly handsome, I suppose, and athletic, and so he comes in. And he comes in verse 13, Eli was sitting on his seat by the road, eagerly watching, because his heart was trembling for the ark of God. I think about a leader, and I think about a leader who said, yeah, sure, go ahead and take the ark of God, and yet his heart is fearful for what he permitted to happen. Eli was of that mind. So the man came to tell to the city, and all the city cried out. And when Eli heard the noise of the outcry, he said, what does the noise of this commotion mean? Then the man came hurriedly and told Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old. His eyes were set so that he could not see. The man said to Eli, I'm the one who came from the battle line. Indeed, I escaped from the battle line today. And Eli said, how did things go, my son? Then the one who brought the news replied, Israel has fled before the Philistines. There's been a great slaughter among the people. Your two sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been taken. Eli was the high priest. It was his job to keep that safe, to keep that, make sure that was the right use, that was his role. He was designed, his office was to keep that safe, and he failed. Now, his role as a father was also to raise two boys who understood that, and he failed there too. But notice that there's a cry about that, and these things that we see happening and brought out here, it causes great pain to the nation of Israel. This was before there was a temple. The ark was kept in Shiloh, and this is where their center of worship was before anything was ever created. So it's kind of hard to picture that. But Eli knew that he had let the ark go in a dangerous situation. He had let it go into a bad situation. And that's why he's anxious. And he falls off his seat backwards. Verse 18, when he is mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell off the seat backwards beside the gate. His neck was broken and he died, for he is old and heavy. Thus he judged Israel for 40 years. When God gave a prophecy to Eli, he didn't tell him everything that was going to happen. You know, there's a lot of prophecies in the New Testament, particularly the book of Revelation. We don't know everything that's going to happen in there. You know, there's things sometimes that we look around, we wonder. Someone asked me the other day if this new virus was part of God's judgment on the world. You know, there's 30,000 people that have this new virus. 700 people have died, and I've heard in the news that those numbers are serious, but did you know 7,000 people have died from the flu? And we're not talking about a virus for the flu. God's still working things in this world that we don't completely understand. It's not completely, he didn't tell us everything. But what's seen here is that they only saw the fulfillment of the entire prophecy on the day, and when they finally saw it, they understood the depth of it. So you have this situation where things are just really, really very, very bad. And as we look at it and we think about it, we think, okay, so now we're seeing the state of the Israel. The nation is kind of falling apart. And even the family of Eli is going to be deeply struck by this. In verse 19, now his daughter-in-law, Phinehas' wife, was pregnant and was about to give birth. And when she heard the news that the ark of God was taken and that her father-in-law and her husband had died, this is a bad day. This is a really bad day. She heard all these things that happened. She kneeled down and gave birth, for her pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, the women who stood by her said to her, "Do not be afraid, you've given birth to a son." But she did not answer or pay attention. Then she called the boy Ichabod, saying the glory had departed from Israel. What's fascinating about this is that most commentaries believe that it's not that the glory of God departed. The glory of God never left. It was the ark of God that left. God was just about to show himself powerful through the most desperate of situations. Have you ever been in a hard situation and things got really hard, and then you begin to realize that now God can show his power? You get to the point where things are very desperate, things are really, really hard to understand, and yet you know now everything else has been stripped away. That's what God's doing to the nation of Israel. And sometimes that's what God does to you and I. When I was 19 or so, I went through kind of a difficult time. And looks like I'm getting the time, or is it? Oh, okay. That's all right. I'll watch the time. I'll try to be careful. But when I was about 19, there was a series of things that happened to me that I kind of was amazed at. There was a period of probably I'd say about 18 months where everything began to fall apart for me. You ever had a period of your life that's like that, where things just fell apart? I was a believer, but I was not walking with the Lord. And in that middle of that time frame, one of the things that happened was I remember thinking I didn't feel very good one day. So I was young. I could do, how you men know exactly what I'm talking about. You could just, you'd eat when you want to eat. If you didn't eat, so no big deal, and so I remember thinking that I was going to the bathroom a lot. Sorry for the TMI, too much information. But I thought, well, maybe I have a kidney infection. So I said, well, I'm going to go down and get that checked out, see if that's a problem. But before I went down there, I went over to a friend's house, to a friend's store. He had a cheese factory type, not cheese factory, but a cheese shop. And he says, hey, you got to taste this. This is this New York cheesecake. It's delicious. I said, oh, that sounds good. So I had one piece of cheesecake and said, hey, I think I can afford another piece of cheesecake. So I had 2 pieces of cheesecake. I hadn't eaten for 2 days. So I'm hungry. I'm eating 2 pieces of cheesecake. And I'll say I eat something better later. So then I went down to the hospital and I said, yeah, I think I'm having a kidney problem. and a kidney infection or something, so I'd like to get that checked. So they said, what they tell you, we got to take a test here, do this. And so I did that. So then I as soon as I gave him the sample and went down there, I'm going to go down to the restaurant here and get something to eat because I haven't eaten much. So I went downstairs and ordered something to eat, and then got this call over the intercom, said, Robert Allen, please come to the, wherever it was, I don't remember. So, 4th floor or whatever. So I said, oh, well, so I'm eating this as fast as I can and getting that in there, and finally I get in the elevator. When I get in the elevator, it goes up and I go out. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in the hospital when you're in the elevator and someone passes out in the elevator. I can't imagine what everyone thought when I passed out in that elevator. But I passed flat out. Boom. I just hit the ground and probably everybody on the way down. And then I woke up again. I was in the ER and went to sleep again, or passed out again. And a couple days later, or hours later, I woke up and I was in my own room. And they said, well, you came in with a blood sugar of 800. He said, we don't even know how you walked into the hospital at 800. That's when I found out I was diabetic. And just before I had my blood test, I took 2 big old pieces of cheesecake. What a good advice. And just a word of warning, if you're diabetic, avoid New York cheesecake. But what that did for me, it took away one of my gods. One of my idols. You may not know it by looking at me now, but I used to be a swimmer. I was a pretty good swimmer. I was competitive. I used to swim 2.5 hours in the morning, 2.5 hours in the afternoon. We'd swim kilometers in the morning for our distance and feet in the afternoon for our speed so we could sprint. And, so I had a real confidence in who I was physically but that idol, that thing I trusted in to always get me through, was taken away. And I remain a diabetic to this day. Another thing that happened was I always thought I was kind of smart, We all think we're smart. No, I don't think anybody wakes up and thinks I'm not so smart. I hope not. But, I thought I was kind of smart, thought I was kind of quick, and there was a guy who thought I was too, and so he put me in the life insurance, and he said, I'm going to teach you, and you're going to make $1 million just like me. You're going to be a millionaire by the time you're 30. Boy, I got a lot of potential in you. And I never sold a single life insurance policy. I failed miserably at that. And you know what? That was another idol that God took away. He decided, you know what? You're leaning on your smarts too much. And maybe that needs to be reevaluated. And in the middle of that, I had to run away from that. Scared me deeper than I can tell you. And so I'd always pictured myself as making it in Europe. And this may sound funny to you, but so I pretty much bought a ticket for Switzerland, and I was going to go over there and work in a grocery store and see if I could earn a living running a grocery store and living in Europe and make it in Europe. And I worked my way all the way across Europe, France, worked my way into Switzerland, got into Switzerland, and knocked on a door and said, yeah, so-and-so sent me. And the guy said, go away, we don't need you. I didn't know what to do. I was shocked, that I couldn't go there, But, here's all these little things we thought would be our redemption or our salvation or what we thought we could depend on. And God broke them down one at a time, much almost like I sometimes picture these things. There's several others, but I picture it almost like the gods of the nation of Egypt that were being destroyed by the plagues. And God says, this is what you trust in, it's going to turn on you. Maybe you've trusted in the same thing. Maybe there's things you put your confidence in, and God says, you know what? You are too precious to me to let you depend on anything else. That's what he's saying to the nation of Israel. You are too precious to have an idol, so I'm going to take that idol away. Now, don't think that everything you love, that doesn't mean that God is playing games and taking away the things you love. It means that he's working in your life to make you more like Christ. And these were things that needed to be taken away, things that I needed to learn. So when we look at what happened in the nation, And we look at this wife of Phinehas. She thinks God's glory has departed. But the truth is, God's glory is just starting to be shown, because he's going to show them who he is, and you see that in the coming chapters. She thinks in verse 22 that the glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God was taken. But God was never in the ark. God was never in any idol that you ever held. God can't be contained by a box, can't be contained by the ark. And the nation of Israel was wrong to look to something other than God for redemption. Now, you think, well, it was the ark of God. Why wasn't that okay? You and I have our little things we think will save us from the problem. And sometimes they're silly things. But the lessons in Samuel are obvious. You cannot maintain an idol when God intends to make you holy. He won't let you. He won't let you. And he will do what it takes to remove that from you. But just because that idol is God does not mean God is gone. Just because something gets removed from our lives because it was unnecessary doesn't mean that God's completed with us. So the glory never departed from Israel. God is beginning to show his glory through this. And as we look at this, God actually is not the loser in this. God has gleaned this problem of putting their confidence in a box rather than in God, and he's starting to teach the nation of Israel how not to trust in boxes, but how to only trust in him. And, we need that lesson every day. Every day. And I hope that that's kind of evident and obvious to you. Hopefully, and as you see this, and you see this lesson that's in chapter 4, if you get a chance to read on, you'll see how God manifests his power through the ark. He'll show who he is more, and pretty soon the ark becomes because the Philistines have it, they don't quite know what to do with it. God's going to kind of give them a direction on this is not a healthy thing for you. There's some really strange pictures in the following chapters, and if you want to see the strangest little offering to God that you've ever seen, keep reading in there. You'll read about golden hemorrhoids and rats, and how they're trying to appease a God that they know has afflicted them because of their actions. But anyway, that's a little bit, and I just kind of wanted to walk through that, and I thought maybe this might be interesting to you. I just am loving 1 Samuel, and I hope that you have the chance to kind of read some of these things. And you know what I do sometimes when I'm reading these, and this is just a word of advice. Sometimes I'll read through the passage, then I'll listen to someone else who preaches on it, and then I'll read through it again and look at it again and study a little bit more and try to find my own notes and kind of build out the story a little bit more, because there's always a little bit more to the story than you can just in reading the text, and you start to understand the relationships, and hopefully that's a healthy thing. But I hope that tonight, as you look at your life, you are willing to say to God, God, I want to hold all things loosely. I don't want to hold on tightly to anything that could potentially replace my trust in you. And it's just critical for our Christian walk. It's absolutely critical. So let's have a word of prayer, and then I think I'll let you take it over here.